The lumberjack stepped into the cave seeking shelter, never knowing an Apache widow had already claimed it as her last safe place. The storm had rolled in fast, sooner than expected. Thick clouds had spilled down from the northern Arizona peaks before midday, and by the time Jack Carter realized how quickly it was closing in, the trail behind him had already vanished beneath a wall of snow. He'd been cutting timber since dawn, dropping 2 good-sized pines and trimming them down into lengths he could haul once the spring thaw came. But he'd pushed too long thinking he could squeeze in one more cut. Then the wind turned sharp, and the sky disappeared into white. The forest vanished into swirling frost, every tree just a shifting shadow, and the cold bit into his ribs like steel. Jack trudged forward through knee-deep drifts, boots slipping, shoulders hunched against the wind. His gloves were soaked, stiff fingers burning beneath frozen wool, and the axe strapped across his back jabbed into him with every step. He was no stranger to brutal winters, had lived through plenty, but this one was meaner than most. The kind that could kill a man if he didn't find cover quick. His mule had bolted hours ago, spooked by the shrieking wind and sudden burst of white. Jack hadn't had it in him to chase the beast. All he had left was the pack on his back, some stale bread, a sliver of salted pork, and a flint kit. He muttered a curse as his boot hit a frozen root and sent him crashing to one knee. Pain shot through his leg, but he bit down and shoved himself upright. He'd been alone for years. Ever since Caleb Carter, his brother, his shadow, was crushed beneath a log in a logging camp, a moment Jack still saw in every dream. No one was coming for him. He knew that. If he didn't keep moving, he'd be one more body buried in snow. He'd told himself 100 times over he didn't need anyone. Work solitude, cold mornings, with nothing but pine and silence. That had been enough. But storms like this could shake a man's stubbornness to the core. Through the wind-whipped white, he spotted it, a jagged break in the cliffside ahead. He squinted through the sting in his eyes. Yep, a shadow tucked just to the right. A cave. Relief hit him like a fist to the chest. He stumbled forward, half crawling, half dragging himself across the drift until he reached the dark opening. Snow howled at his back, slashing sideways, but inside the cave. The wind stopped. The silence wrapped around him like a blanket. Jack pulled back his hood and shook the ice from his beard. His vision adjusted slow. At first, just stone and shadow. But then, a flicker. Firelight. Deep in the cave. He froze. Someone was here. A fire burned low near the far wall, and beside it, a figure. A woman sat motionless. Her dark hair spilled down over her shoulders, a heavy wool blanket wrapped tight around her small frame. Beneath it, he caught the edge of a worn deerskin dress, the beadwork faded with age. One shoulder torn, revealing a glimpse of bare skin glowing softly in the fire's light. Her posture never changed, but her eyes deep brown, sharp, as blades locked onto him the moment he stepped inside. In her hand, she gripped a stone. Not decoration. A weapon. Jack slowly raised his hand's axe, still strapped across his back. His heart slammed against his ribs. He'd expected emptiness. Maybe a wolf, maybe nothing. Not this. Not a woman alone buried this deep in the wilderness. "I don't want trouble," he said, voice raw from the cold. "Storm's bad out there. Just need a place to wait it out." She didn't answer. Her eyes stayed hard, unreadable. She pulled the blanket higher across her chest, but the stone never dropped. Jack shifted on his feet, uncertain. The cold still gnawed at his bones. His gloves stiff as bark, his boots soaked through. He didn't have it in him to turn back into the storm, not with night coming fast. So he held his ground palms open, breathing hard. His mind worked fast. Apache. He recognized the beadwork, the shape of her face. He'd seen Apache camps burned, heard stories whispered around frontier fires, some he wished he'd never heard. He'd seen white men treat Apache women like war trophies, and his gut twisted with the memory. But this wasn't a war camp. This was one woman, alone, surviving. The fire snapped. The sound was sharp, startling. She never looked away. Jack's jaw clenched. He wanted to speak, to explain, maybe offer his name, but words felt hollow out here. He'd lived too long like this, avoiding people, carrying grief like a second skin. Still, her gaze did something to him, pressed against the walls he'd built, made him question whether turning back into the storm might hurt less than staying. But something held him rooted, something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. The memory of his brother came flooding back the moment the log had rolled and crushed Caleb Carter, while Jack Carter stood frozen too slow to save him. He'd walked away from that camp afterward, swallowed by guilt, choosing solitude over the company of men. If he walked out of this cave now, it would be the same all over again, turning his back, leaving someone to whatever fate decided. So he lowered his hands, took one careful step backward toward the cave wall, not forward. He set his pack down slowly on the cold stone floor, deliberate in every motion. Then he eased himself down to sit, keeping his distance. The fire cast their shadows long across the cave walls. For a long while, neither moved. Outside, the storm howled like a living beast shaking the mountains. Inside, there was only the low crackle of fire and the sound of Ayanna Skyfeather's quiet, measured breathing. Jack's thoughts spun in circles. Who was she? How long had she survived out here? Why was she alone? But he kept his silence. He had no right to ask, not yet. The woman shifted slightly, tugging her blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her eyes softened just a trace, not much, but enough to let him breathe again. She didn't drop the stone she clutched, but she didn't raise it higher either. In that moment, Jack understood. This wasn't his shelter. It was hers. He was the one trespassing. And if he wanted to survive the night, it wouldn't be by strength, it would be by respect. So he leaned back against the rough wall, letting the fire warm him from a safe distance. His thoughts steadied, though they felt heavy in his chest. For now, survival was all that mattered. Whatever came after trust, words, or something else would have to wait. The storm raged on through the night, screaming across the rocks, piling snow against the cave mouth, until the world outside became nothing but wind and white. Inside, the fire burned low, painting the stone walls in trembling shades of amber. Jack sat against the far side, his boots stretched out, watching Ayanna without staring. She hadn't moved much since he came in. The blanket still hugged her shoulders, her knees tucked close, the stone still in her hand, though her grip had eased. In the dim light, he could see the sharpness of her cheekbones, the fatigue etched around her mouth, the deerskin dress torn and worn thin. She was younger than he'd thought at first glance, maybe mid-20s, but her eyes held a lifetime of loss. He didn't need her to tell him what had happened. The Apache bands had been shattered, broken by raids led by men like Jed Raleigh and his kind hunted by soldiers scattered across the land. Some women were captured, others sold, and a few like her escaped, left to survive alone in the wild. Looking at her now, he understood why she'd chosen this cave, hidden dry close to water, a place beyond the reach of cruelty. His stomach twisted. He thought of the small amount of food left in his pack. Moving slow so she wouldn't startle, he reached for it, She tensed, eyes narrowing, the stone shifting slightly in her grip. But when he pulled out a strip of hard bread and snapped it in half, her fingers froze. He slid the larger piece toward her with the toe of his boot, then bit into the smaller one himself. The crunch sounded loud in the silence. She didn't touch her half at first. Her gaze flicked from his face to the bread, weighing his intent. Only after a long pause did she reach out quickly, pulling it beneath her blanket. She ate in small, careful bites, her eyes never leaving his. Jack chewed slowly, the dryness catching in his throat. He reached for his canteen, took a swallow, then pushed it across the stone toward her. Again she hesitated, then lifted it, drinking only a little before handing it back. Her hand trembled slightly. It was nothing more than bread and water, yet the moment carried more weight than words ever could. Jack released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Hours passed. He tried to rest, closing his eyes, but the cold stone floor and the sound of her breathing kept him half awake. When he opened them again, the fire had dimmed, but she was moving, feeding small sticks into the flames from a bundle in the corner. He hadn't noticed them before. She must have gathered them ahead of the storm. She leaned close to the fire, her blanket slipping down her shoulder, the torn deerskin shifting with her movement. The glow of the flames caught on her skin, soft pale against the dark leather. Jack turned his gaze away, shame tightening in his chest, heat rising under the cold. He busied himself with the silence, pretending not to see, though his heart beat loud in his ears. He tried to focus on anything but her, his thoughts drifting back to why he'd ever ended up in this valley to begin with. After Caleb Carter's death, Jack had never been the same. He'd drifted from camp to camp, deeper into the timber country, farther from towns, and the noise that echoed with memories he couldn't stand to relive. Cutting trees, swinging an axe, hearing the crack of wood, it gave him something to hold on to. It was work he could control, but the nights were long, and the silence louder than any saw. He never found an answer to that emptiness, just kept working. Until now. The quiet broke, soft, rasped from disuse. Niele. She spoke it like a warning, but something in the way she said it made it feel like a thread offered across the fire. Jack looked up, met her eyes. He repeated the name slowly, careful with it. Niele. Then he tapped his chest. Jack. Her gaze didn't shift for a moment. Then she gave a small nod, barely more than a blink. But in that cave with the storm snarling outside, it felt like more than just names. It felt like a fragile agreement. They didn't speak again for a long while. When the fire began to die down, Jack stood. She tensed immediately, clutching the stone tighter, but he didn't move toward her. He walked to the cave mouth, boots crunching over the frozen floor. The snow had stacked high, nearly sealing them in. He broke through the drift with his boots and dug under the rock ledges, pulling free an armful of frozen branches. His gloves were stiff fingers, nearly numb, but he managed. He returned, crouched near the fire, and began splitting wood into smaller pieces with the back of his axe. She watched him the entire time. Her face unreadable beneath the blanket pulled tight. He wondered what she saw, a stranger, pale-skinned, marked by a scar along his temple eyes from the cold. He was an intruder, yes, but not a threat. He'd brought firewood instead of fear. When the flames rose again, warmth filled the cave. Jack leaned back against the wall, his body sagging under exhaustion. For a brief second their eyes met, and this time Ayanna Skyfeather didn't look away. It wasn't trust, not yet. But it wasn't rejection either. Just the unspoken truth they were trapped here together, and whatever each of them carried, pain, guilt, fear, would have to wait. Survival came first. Later, when the fire was no more than glowing coals, Jack slipped into a restless sleep axe still beside him. Outside, the wind screamed like a wounded beast. Ayanna stayed awake longer, eyes steady on him, weighing the man who had stumbled into her cave. Was he danger or something else? For the first time in months, she didn't know what to believe. The fire had burned low again by the time Jack stirred neck-sore from leaning against the cave wall. Pale morning light filtered through snow-packed cracks at the entrance. For a moment he forgot where he was, his body braced like he was back in a logging camp, waiting on saw whistles and shouted orders. But there were no men here, no voices. Just the faint pop of embers and the rustle of movement. Ayanna was crouched by the fire, wrapped in her blanket, feeding small twigs to the flames. Her dark hair spilled forward, nearly brushing the coals. She turned slightly at the sound of him shifting. Her eyes didn't startle, but watched, guarded. Jack sat up slowly, joints aching, chest tight with the cold air. The bread he'd shared last night was gone, just crumbs left near her feet. She hadn't touched anything else, not even looked at his pack. That hit him in a strange way, like respect, or maybe restraint. He reached into his pack again, pulled out a strip of salted pork wrapped in cloth, and set it on the stone between them. He tore off a bite for himself, then nodded toward the rest. After a short pause, she reached out and took it. Quick fingers, swift as ever. He was the first to speak. His voice was scratchy, not used to breaking silence. "How long you been here?" She studied him, then tilted her head toward the entrance. "Since summer." The words were few, her English rough, but clear enough. Jack's brows pulled down. "Alone." She nodded once. The weight of it dropped heavy in his gut. A woman out here all these months. Through storms, through hunger, gathering wood, surviving whatever came her way. He tried not to show the ache in his chest as he looked at her. Without saying more, she reached under her blanket and pulled out a small pouch. She placed it between them. Inside, dried berries, bits of acorn meal, scraps of venison. Not much. Enough to get by. Barely. His thoughts flashed to the mule he'd lost in the blizzard, packed with grain and salted meat, all of it now buried in snow. The thought gnawed at him. They sat in silence until her voice came again, quieter now. "Husband, dead." She didn't look at him, just stared at the fire. Raiders. Jack swallowed hard. That word cut deeper than he'd expected. He stared at the flames, jaw tight. He'd heard it too many times, knew too well what it meant. He didn't speak. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't sound hollow. So he sat beside her, the fire between them, and let the moment burn on. The words hit Jack Carter harder than he'd expected. His jaw tightened as he stared into the fire. It shouldn't have surprised him. Most widows he'd met out on the frontier carried stories like this, stories carved out by cruelty and blood. Still hearing it from Ayanna Skyfeather's mouth made the silence in that cave even heavier. Shame crept in, cold and sharp. Shame that men like him, white men, had been part of those raids. Shame that he hadn't stopped any of it. Anger, too anger, that a woman had to bury herself in stone and snow just to stay alive. He wanted to say something, but nothing in his throat felt worthy. So instead he reached for his axe, dragged it toward him, and grabbed one of the branches from the pile he'd gathered earlier. The clang of steel striking wood echoed through the cave, rhythmic, steady, purposeful. It was the only way he knew how to speak. Through action, not words. She watched him closely, her face unreadable. Then after a moment, she pulled something from her bundle, a bone needle and sinew thread. Quietly, without asking, she picked up his torn coat and began to mend the sleeve. That's how the morning passed. Jack split firewood. Ayanna sewed. No words, just two souls working side by side. Outside, the storm had dulled to a quieter rhythm. Snow still fell, but without the savage roar of the night before. They didn't speak again, but something between them had shifted. Around midday, Jack stood and gestured toward the cave mouth, lifting an eyebrow, wordless offering to go together. Ayanna pulled the blanket tighter and shook her head. He understood. If she'd been hiding out this long, the world outside had only brought danger. So he stepped out alone. The wind still cut through his coat, stinging his skin, but he pushed into it anyway, dragging back more frozen branches until his arms burned. When he returned, she had moved closer to the fire. The blanket had slipped slightly, the torn deerskin revealing more of her shoulder. Firelight brushed her skin soft and bare, and something about the sight made Jack's eyes dart away. There was beauty in it, but also pain. Vulnerability. He wouldn't take advantage of either. That night, once darkness settled in again, he made a spot for himself farther from the fire, letting her keep the warmth. She glanced over as he stretched out on the stone floor, pulling his coat around him, axe always near. There was a question in her eyes. Why not closer? Why not take what you could? But she didn't ask, and he didn't offer an answer. He had no right. Sleep didn't come easy. He listened to the soft rustle of her blanket, the sound of her breath, real present. He hadn't shared space with a woman since before Caleb Carter died. The weight of it pressed down on him. One misstep, one wrong look, one word said the wrong way, and he could shatter this fragile balance between them. He rolled onto his side, jaw clenched, facing the cold wall. He would not be the kind of man she feared. Just before dawn, when the fire was down to ash and the cold crept deep into his bones, Jack stirred. And there it was, a corner of the blanket gently extended across the space between them. Not a word, no invitation, just warmth, offered. He hesitated. His hand hovered, then slowly, gently, he pulled it over his shoulders. She didn't move, didn't open her eyes, but her breathing remained calm. It was such a small gesture. Yet in that cave, in that storm, it meant more than any sentence ever could. He lay back down, and for the first time since the snow had begun to fall, Jack felt something beyond survival. He felt the first stirrings of trust. By morning, the thought of that blanket still lingered in his chest. The fire had died low again, and cold seeped into the stone. But the wool across his shoulders reminded him she'd done that. Not by mistake. Not by accident. She never acknowledged it, not with a glance, not with a word, but that silence carried meaning. He rose quietly, careful not to wake her, though something about her breath told him she was only pretending to sleep. Jack moved to the entrance, his boots crunching snow as he kicked away the buildup. The storm had calmed overnight, but the world outside was still sealed in white. The snow came up to his thighs, and the wind carried an edge sharp enough to cut through fur and hide. He gathered wood from beneath the ledge where the storm hadn't reached everything. When he stepped back into the cave, arms full, Ayanna was sitting upright. The blanket hugged tight around her shoulders, her eyes tracking him silently. She said nothing, but there was no fear in her gaze now. Just watching. Jack crouched beside the fire, breaking the branches down slowly with his axe. His movements calm and deliberate. No sudden gestures. No threat. She shifted slightly, reached into the corner of the cave, and pulled out something he hadn't noticed before, a small clay pot. She placed it near the flames. Inside were scraps of dried venison and a few berries. She poured water from a skin bag into the pot and stirred it with a slender stick. Jack didn't say a word. He just watched the steam rise, and for the first time since entering that cave, he let himself feel the warmth of more than just fire. The scent of simmering broth drifted through the cave, faint, but enough to stir Jack Carter's hunger. When the stew was ready, Ayanna Skyfeather poured some into a wooden bowl and placed it between them without a word. Jack hesitated, unsure if the offer was for both of them or just a gesture. She gave him a single glance, a small dip of her chin, then nudged the bowl closer to the fire, where he could easily reach it. Jack let out a slow breath, picked it up, and took a sip. It was thin, more water than meat, but warm enough to chase the ache from his chest. He drank half and slid the bowl back toward her. She finished it in small, cautious sips, her eyes meeting his every now and then, but never holding for long. The silence stretched until Jack finally broke it, his voice low. "You've been here since summer. Why stay? Why not move on? Find another camp, another place." Her gaze sharpened. No camp. She shook her head once. No people left. Those 4 words hit harder than the wind outside. No people left. He wanted to ask more, but her shoulders had gone rigid, her jaw set tight. He recognized that look. It was the same one he gave when folks asked about Caleb. Some pain lived too deep for words, so he simply nodded, saying nothing. Instead, he decided to give something of himself, something that might answer her silence. "I cut timber," he said, pointing to the axe leaning beside the wall. "Been at it a long time." He paused, then added, "Had a brother. He worked with me. He's gone now." His throat thickened with the words. That was all he could manage. She stared at him for a while, her face unreadable. Then softly, with a tilt of her head, she spoke. "Jack." His name in her voice hit him like a shot to the chest, firm, steady, but gentle all the same. It was the first time she'd said it. He swallowed hard, unsure if it settled him or shook him. That day passed in quiet rhythm. Jack went out twice to gather more wood, breaking it down so it'd burn smoother. Ayanna stayed inside, tending to her own tasks, sorting berries, stitching a widening tear in her dress. He watched how deftly her hands moved, fast and sure, and when her blanket slipped from her shoulder, she didn't fix it right away. The firelight slid over her skin, across her collarbone, down to the curve of her chest, pale against the torn leather. He caught himself staring too long, shame, and something heavier knotting inside him. He forced his eyes away. That night when they settled near the fire again, she spoke first. "Why you stay?" He frowned, unsure if he wanted to answer. She tilted her head slightly. "Storm will end. You can go." "So, why stay here?" Jack leaned back, staring into the flames. He thought about lying, saying he was just waiting out the cold. But that wasn't true. He rubbed at the scar on his temple, the old one that never quite stopped aching. "I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe because there's not much waiting for me out there. Maybe because you're here." Her eyes held his steady and calm. She didn't speak. Didn't look away either. Later, when the fire had burned low and the dark wrapped tight around them, they lay down again. Jack settled in a bit closer this time. Not touching, not too near, but closer. And this time, Ayanna didn't wait until he was asleep. She shifted the blanket they shared, draping it over both of them. Her side brushed his, her hair soft, as it brushed across his shoulder. He lay stiff, unsure if he should stay still or lean in. But when she settled calmly, her breathing even, he finally let himself relax. In the stillness, questions circled in his mind. How had she survived? What dangers still waited outside this cave? He didn't ask. Not yet. Trust, he knew, was like building a fire. It started with the smallest spark and needed care to grow. As sleep pulled him under, something dawned on him. He didn't see the cave as hers anymore. Or his. It was theirs now. If she'd have it. And though she hadn't said the words, the way she had shared that blanket told him all he needed. The next morning came with quiet stillness. The only sound was the slow drip of ice melting near the mouth of the cave. The storm had passed, but snow still blanketed the world in thick silence. Harsh light crept in pale and cold. Jack rose first, stiff from sleeping on stone, but warmer than he'd been in days thanks to the shared blanket. He looked over at Ayanna. She was already awake, watching him. He gave her a small nod, said nothing, and shrugged on his coat. His pack was nearly bare now. Just one strip of pork left the last of the bread. He'd have to stretch it. He knelt by the fire, stirred the dying embers, and fed it new wood. The warmth slowly crept back in, but it wasn't just the fire that made the place feel less cold. It was the woman beside him, the one who'd said nothing but offered everything. The fire snapped and hissed as it climbed higher, casting flickering shadows against the rock walls. Ayanna Skyfeather reached for her small clay pot, poured water from her skin bag, and dropped in the last few berries she had. She didn't say a word, but when she placed the pot near the flames, she nudged it just a bit closer to where Jack Carter sat. It was a quiet gesture, but not meaningless. Jack chewed the last bite of dry bread, his thoughts running bitter. He kept thinking about the damn mule lost in the blizzard and the bags of grain and meat that had vanished with its supplies that could have kept them going for weeks. He muttered a curse under his breath. Without that food, the margin between survival and starvation had grown razor thin. He'd have to hunt soon once the wind settled. He looked at Ayanna, noting how frail her arms looked beneath that threadbare blanket. She'd lasted months like this, living off scraps, foraging, drawing deer when she could gathering acorns. But she couldn't keep it up on her own. He needed to pull his weight. He tried to speak, fumbling for words that might make sense to her. "Hunt," he said, nodding toward the mouth of the cave. Then he mimed drawing a bowstring and letting it fly. His hand hung in the air. She tilted her head, watching him. Then she gave a slow nod. Her eyes softened just a bit, maybe a flicker of understanding or relief. She knew he meant to bring food, not scavenge from what little she had left. The day wore on. Jack stepped outside twice, axe in hand, testing the snowdrifts. They were deep, heavy, but not impassable. He searched for tracks. Rabbit, maybe deer, but the storm had wiped the forest clean. He returned empty both times, muscles burning from trudging through thigh-high drifts. Ayanna never said a word of blame. No sighs, no disappointment, just poured broth from the pot into their shared wooden bowl and split it down the middle. When she passed the bowl to him, her fingers brushed his. That brief touch, barely a second, lit a trail of fire down his arm hotter than the flames beside him. That night, something in the cave had changed. Jack sat close to the fire coat, steaming from the snow, while Ayanna mended a rip in her dress with a bone needle. The fabric was thin, barely holding together. When she shifted, the neckline slipped, revealing the line of her chest. She caught him looking. Their eyes locked for a beat too long. Then she lowered her gaze, not embarrassed, just unreadable. But she didn't flinch, didn't recoil, didn't fade into the shadows. Her shoulders stayed squared steady, like she was waiting to see if he'd press the moment. Jack's chest tightened. He'd spent years in silence, gone longer without the warmth of a woman than he could count. But he wasn't about to take something that wasn't freely given. He wasn't like the men who treated women like trophies of war. So he stood, grabbed his axe, and split wood instead, letting the thud of blade on bark quiet the storm inside his head. When he returned, something unexpected happened. Ayanna leaned forward and laid his coat in his lap. The seam had been stitched careful and clean. Her hand stayed a moment too long. Her eyes met his clear, direct, unblinking. Then she whispered, "Jack." He swallowed hard. "Ayanna," he replied. That night the space between them shrank. They lay down as before near the fire, the blanket pulled over both. But this time Jack didn't drift to the edge. He stayed close, his arm brushing hers through the wool. She shifted once, then went still. Her hand rested on the stone between them. After a long silence, she moved it closer. Her fingers touched the back of his hand. He froze. Was it an accident? No. Her hand stayed. Warm. Intentional. Slowly he turned his palm up, offering without asking. She slid her fingers into his, lacing them gently but firmly. No words were spoken. The fire cracked, and the wind whispered outside the cave. But inside something sacred had formed, silent and powerful. Jack lay awake long after she'd fallen asleep, staring at the rough ceiling overhead. That small touch, that trust, he knew how easily it could be broken. One wrong move, one careless word, and she'd pull away. But he didn't make a wrong move, and she didn't let go. His chest ached, but not with grief. This ache was different. It was the ache of something beginning. When morning came, he stirred with the fire down to glowing embers. Her hand was still in his. For a second, he thought maybe he'd dreamt it. But the warmth in his palm was real. Her fingers were curled around his, loose but sure. He shifted slightly, not wanting to wake her, but she blinked open her eyes anyway. And for once there was no fear between them. Just quiet understanding. For a long second, she glanced at their joined hands, then at him. Her gaze didn't harden. She didn't pull away. Instead, Ayanna Skyfeather gave the faintest nod, like she understood what she'd done, and meant every bit of it. They stood without speaking. Jack Carter stretched the stiffness from his arms, wincing, as his shoulders cracked from another night on cold stone. Ayanna turned toward the fire, quietly adding dry twigs from her dwindling pile. Their supplies were running thin. He saw it in her pouch, just a few shriveled berries and the last strip of dried venison. It weighed heavy on him. If he didn't bring in meat soon, all this quiet understanding between them would be swallowed up by hunger. "I'll try again," he said, motioning toward the mouth of the cave, mimicking the swing of his axe. She studied him carefully, then shook her head slowly. "Snow too deep," she said, her voice rough but deliberate. He bit the inside of his cheek. She wasn't wrong. The blizzard had wiped everything clean, buried every trail. But sitting and doing nothing, he couldn't stomach that either. "I'll try," he repeated. After a beat, she nodded once. The cold bit down hard outside, but Jack pushed through the drifts, the snow crunching under his boots. He moved along the edge of the forest, eyes sweeping for movement. After nearly an hour, he spotted faint rabbit tracks in the powder. Step by step, he followed them, slow, careful, until he finally brought one down with a hard swing of his axe. It wasn't much, but it was something. When he returned, Ayanna was waiting at the cave entrance, blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. A flash of relief crossed her face, but she quickly masked it. They knelt by the fire together as Jack cleaned the rabbit, and her hands were steady as she used her small knife to help. They worked in rhythm, silent, but in sync. When the meat was done, roasting, the rich scent filled the cave. She tore off a piece and handed it to him first. Jack shook his head and pushed it back toward her. She frowned, then pressed it firmly into his palm. "Eat," she said. He obeyed, chewing slow. The taste was richer than anything he'd had in weeks. That small act of sharing, simple yet intimate, broke through a wall that had stood between them. Later, Ayanna sat close. The blanket slipped down her shoulders as the fire's warmth seeped into her skin. Jack caught her fiddling with the edge of her deerskin dress, her stitching half done. His chest tightened. The dress was torn across the front, revealing the gentle curve of her chest every time she shifted. She noticed him looking, and this time she didn't hide. She didn't pull the blanket tighter. She let it fall. Jack's pulse quickened. He looked away fast, locking his hands to his knees to stop them from reaching out. His mind split in two, one part whispering that she was offering something more, the other warning how fragile this trust still was. He heard Caleb's voice in his head, clear and steady. "You don't take what isn't freely given, Jack." That voice stayed with him, so he spoke, his tone low and careful. "You don't have to be afraid of me." Plain words. But he meant everyone. Ayanna studied him. Then slowly she lifted her hand and reached across the space between them, her fingers touching the scar near his temple. She traced it gently. Jack froze, breath caught in his throat. No one had touched that scar in years. He'd worn it like a curse. But now she was touching it without fear or pity, only quiet understanding. Her fingers slid down the line of his jaw, resting near his beard. Then she leaned closer, firelight glinting in her eyes. Jack didn't move, afraid he might break the moment. Then slowly he leaned in too. Their lips met, cautious, searching. The kiss was soft, tender, real. She didn't pull away. When he deepened it, her hand pressed firmer to his cheek, grounding him. When they parted, her eyes stayed on his, clear, open. Neither spoke for a long while. The fire cracked and popped, filling the silence. Jack swallowed. His chest rose heavy. "I'll stay," he finally said, voice rough. "As long as you want me to." Ayanna's lips pressed together, then softened. She nodded. Just once. But it was enough. That night they lay side by side beneath the blanket. This time Jack didn't hold back the nearness. Her head settled against his shoulder, her breath warm against his chest. He wrapped an arm around her slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Her hand found his again, their fingers twining together. And as sleep pulled him under, Jack knew something had changed. He wasn't just hiding from a storm anymore. He wasn't just sharing food or shelter anymore. He was opening up a part of himself he'd long buried ever since Caleb Carter died. And when Ayanna Skyfeather whispered his name in the darkness, soft as wind through pine, Jack Carter knew she was offering him something just as sacred, the choice to stay. The morning after their kiss, Jack awoke to find her still nestled against him. He didn't move, didn't dare. Her head lay on his shoulder, hair spilled across his chest like silk, her breath warm and even against the scratchy wool of his shirt. It wasn't her weight, he felt, it was her trust, and that after so many cold and bitter years, settled deeper than any wound he'd carried, He stared at the low burning fire, wondering if she would pull away, pretend the night before had been a mistake. But when she stirred and blinked the sleep from her eyes, she didn't recoil. Her gaze landed on their linked hands, and instead of letting go, she gave his fingers a small, firm squeeze. That was her answer. They rose without speaking, the rhythm of survival nudging them forward. Jack grabbed his axe and stepped into the white world outside. The storm had eased the forest still and silver beneath the sky. Rabbit tracks appeared again, faint in the new snow. He followed them, holding his breath until the axe missed its mark, striking ice, echoing like a gunshot. He cursed under his breath. When he came back empty-handed, he expected disappointment, but Ayanna only looked at him with calm eyes. She pulled the last piece of venison from her pouch, tore it in two, and handed him one half. He shook his head. Her eyes narrowed. "Take it." He did, chewing slowly. They ate in silence, but this time the silence didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a space they shared. Later, as the fire grew stronger, Ayanna tapped his axe with her needle and mimed a chopping motion. "Work," she said. He nodded. "Timber." She repeated it, lips forming the new word. Then she pointed to herself. Ayanna, and then to him. He smiled faintly. Jack. They spent the day that way, building a language. Simple words. Pointing, repeating, laughing once when she said snow, and he answered damn cold. She said sun, and he echoed her. It wasn't fluent, not yet, but it was a bridge. And they were both crossing it. That evening the fire warmed the cave more than usual. Jack sat close, slowly grinding the blade of his axe, watching her stitch the torn seam in her dress. The fabric had ripped worse now, and every time she shifted, more of her skin showed. He tried not to look, but he did, and she saw him. Her eyes held his for a breath. Then deliberately she let the blanket fall a little lower on her shoulders. The air between them thickened not with fear, but with something unspoken and alive. Jack set the axe down slowly, breath tight in his throat. He didn't move. But Ayanna did. She reached across the fire, her fingers brushing his. Then she slid her hand up, turning his palm over, tracing the thick scar across it. Jack swallowed hard. "That happened in the camps," he said quietly, pointing at it. Log slipped. Nearly lost the hand. He wasn't sure she understood, but her eyes never left his. Then she looked at his face, really looked, and her gaze asked a question he hadn't answered in years. He gave it plain and raw. "My brother." He didn't need to explain more. She saw the weight of it in his voice. Slowly she reached up and touched the scar at his temple. Her fingers were warm against his skin, soft against the beard he never bothered shaving anymore. "No more alone," she whispered. The words were broken, but their meaning struck him like thunder. His breath caught, and still she didn't pull back. So he leaned in, slow, giving her the chance to say no. She didn't. Their lips met again, firmer this time, deeper. Her hands curled around his neck, drawing him in, while the blanket slid off her shoulders. His arms wrapped around her like instinct, like need. He didn't think. He just held her. When they parted, their foreheads touched, both of them breathing hard. The firelight danced across her cheeks and his jaw. He wanted to say something, but words failed him. So he just pulled her close again, letting the silence speak for him. That night they shared the same blanket, but now they held each other with purpose. Her head rested against his chest, his arm draped around her waist, steady and sure. For the first time since he'd stepped into this cave, Jack Carter didn't feel like a stranger. He felt Home. He felt it now deep in his bones, like the slow thaw of winter giving way to spring. Jack Carter no longer saw the season ahead as something to endure alone. For the first time in years, he imagined sharing it with her. By the time he realized just how long he'd been inside that cave with Ayanna Skyfeather, the snow outside had begun to lose its grip on the land. The storm had passed, leaving only the quiet drip of melting ice echoing through the trees. Sunlight broke through with more force now, sharp and certain, casting long golden fingers across the frozen valley. Inside, the rhythm of their life had shifted too. Jack and Ayanna no longer moved like strangers surviving in the same space. Everything flowed without words. He split wood and hauled snow for water. She rationed their dwindling food, patched their worn clothes, and kept the fire alive. And when night came, they didn't sleep apart anymore. They lay beneath a single blanket, bodies close, fingers always finding each other in the dark. Yet hunger pressed closer each day. The rabbit meat was gone, the last berries eaten. Jack felt the ache in every muscle, in every breath, as he trudged through knee-deep snow searching for tracks. One morning, coming back empty again, he slammed his axe into the frozen earth at the cave mouth. The crack echoed like gunfire. Ayanna flinched, but didn't back away. Instead, she rose from the fire and came to him. Her hand rested gently on his arm. Enough, she said the word, halting, but clear. Her English was rough, but her eyes steady. It was enough. Jack exhaled, letting the frustration bleed out. He nodded once, pulled the axe free, and laid it aside. Later, as the snow hardened to a crust, he tried again this time, pushing farther along the ridge. Careful, patient. He spotted deer, their bodies cutting through the tree line in soft silence. He didn't get close enough for a clean strike, but it didn't matter. What he carried back wasn't meat, it was hope. The thaw had begun. When he returned, exhausted but lighter, Ayanna had spread their blanket near the fire. She'd taken off her deerskin dress to stitch another tier, her bare shoulders glowing in the firelight. Jack froze. She looked up calm and unguarded. She didn't rush to cover herself. She let him see her strong, unashamed, beautiful. Then slowly she pulled the dress back over her shoulder and resumed her sewing. That night, when they lay down, something electric passed between them. Her hand found his chest. "You stay?" she asked, her voice careful, but full of meaning. He looked into her eyes and closed his fingers gently around hers. "I'll stay." His voice was gravel, but his heart was steady. "Storm ends, snow melts. Don't matter. I stay with you." She searched his face for a long beat, then leaned in, lips meeting his without hesitation. The kiss wasn't shy, it was sure. The choice was made. He pulled her close, his hand resting at the small of her back. She pressed into him, body warm, breath steady. When they pulled apart, her forehead rested against his. "No more alone," she whispered again. Same words as before, but now they rang louder, truer. A vow. Jack closed his eyes, breathing her in, chest tightening, not from pain, but something dangerously close to peace. The days that followed were still rough. The forest was quiet, food still scarce, but something inside them had shifted. Together they were stronger. Jack began teaching her small English words, fire, snow, water. She returned the favor in Apache, laughing when he stumbled. Her laughter filled the cave like sunlight. For the first time in years, silence no longer haunted him. It had been replaced by her voice, her touch, her warmth. At night she'd trace the scar on his temple with her fingers, and he'd wrap his arm around her waist, pulling her close until their breath moved as one. Even when the fire burned low, the heat between them kept the cold away. One evening, as the sky turned amber and the snow outside glowed gold, Jack stood at the cave's mouth with Ayanna beside him. The world was changing. He could hear it, water rushing beneath the ice. And for the first time since the storm began, Jack didn't feel lost in it. He felt ready. Patches of dark earth were breaking through the snow. Spring was no longer a distant thought, it was at their doorstep. Ayanna Skyfeather's fingers slipped into Jack Carter's lacing with quiet certainty. He turned to look at her. She held his gaze steady, unafraid. That's when he knew, when the cave was no longer needed, they'd leave it together. Not just as two souls who'd outlasted a storm, but as something more. As partners. Down below, the river was tearing open its icy grip, long seams cracking through the frost. The rush of water echoed up the valley. Snow peeled back from the pine roots, leaving behind muddy earth and splintered branches. The birds were the first to return their calls sharp against the cliffs, a sign that the land was waking up again. By the second week of the melt, Jack no longer saw the cave as a trap, it had become a haven. But the wild outside was calling. One morning, he stood at the cave's mouth, axe in hand, watching the forest stretch and breathe beneath the sun. Ayanna joined him quietly, a worn blanket slung over her shoulders. Her dark hair caught the breeze, eyes locked on the trees down in the valley. She said nothing, just slid her hand into his. He wove their fingers together, simple, sure. A gesture that felt like a vow. Inside, their food was nearly gone again. Hunting would get easier with the thaw, but Jack knew the cave had given them all it could. He turned to her. "We can't stay here forever," he said. She tensed a little but didn't pull away. "Build something," he asked gently. "A cabin, near the timberline." He looked at the threads holding her old dress together. Worn, stretched thin by months of survival. "We'll have more than scraps, more than hiding." She didn't answer right away, just looked at him, searching his face for truth. Then at last she nodded, slow and certain. Together, she said, one word, but it landed heavier than 1,000 others. They gathered what they had. Jack packed his axe, flint, and canteen. Ayanna folded her blanket tight, carried her clay pot and sewing needle like sacred treasures. Before they left, she knelt once more by the fire pit, touching the stones she'd stacked with trembling hands months ago. Then she let her fingers fall. That place had saved her life, but it no longer held her. The descent into the valley was rough. Snow clung in the hollows, slick and stubborn. Jack took the lead, cutting the path with heavy boots, helping her down steep slopes. Ayanna never complained, her steps strong, her grip steady when the ice bit back. By the time they reached the lower ridge, the sun hung high, and the scent of thawed soil rose around them like a promise. That afternoon they reached the river. Jack cut branches and lashed them into a makeshift raft, his hands working with quiet focus. Ayanna helped fingers steady on the knots. When they launched into the current, the water fought them, but Jack held firm, guiding them across with sheer grit. On the far bank she stumbled and dropped to her knees, then laughed, a soft, sudden sound that made him stop. He turned, startled, and smiled. Really smiled. Not the polite kind, not the guarded one, but a real breaking through grin that cracked the silence wide open. They traveled 2 more days through the thickening mud and waking brush. Then came the edge of a town, a small frontier settlement with smoke curling from chimneys and muddy boots by every door. Jack stopped before the main road. His jaw clenched. He hadn't walked into a place like this in years, and never with someone like Ayanna. For her, the risk was worse. A white man and an Apache widow folks would stare. Maybe worse. He looked at her. If we go in, they'll talk. Might even do more than that. You sure? Her chin lifted. Her eyes didn't waver. With you, she said, plain and clear. So they stepped in together. Just like he'd feared, the whispers came fast. Stares followed them, rough boots pausing, mid-step voices quieting behind shop windows. A scarred lumberjack walking side by side with a woman from the people settlers feared and hated. But neither of them looked back. They weren't here to ask permission. They were here to start something new. Some folks narrowed their eyes, others turned away, but no one dared step forward. Jack Carter's grip tightened around Ayanna Skyfeather's hand, steady as stone, daring any man in town to challenge it. At the general store, he bought what they needed: tools, seeds, flour, and a new coat for her. Paid in full from the coins he'd saved during years of back-breaking logging. The shopkeeper Silas Boone lingered with a hard stare, but Jack didn't flinch. When Ayanna slipped the coat over her shoulders, her expression softened. She reached for Jack's arm with a touch light, as wind, thanks unspoken, but loud all the same. They didn't stay long. By sundown, they were gone, heading toward the timber country. Jack picked a ridge near the river, where the land was firm, and the trees stood thick and straight. A place where something could last. That's where they started building. Jack brought down the pines, trimming each log clean. Together, they dragged them into place, shoulders aching, but spirits steady. Ayanna gathered stone for a hearth, never slowing, never stopping. Her movements were tireless, deliberate. At night they slept beneath the stars, fire crackling near the river's voice running beside them. Days rolled on. One log at a time, the walls of their cabin began to rise. By the time the trees began to bud, a rough little home stood tall on that ridge. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, and it was strong. One evening, as the firelight spilled golden across the clearing, Jack wiped the sweat from his brow and ran his calloused hand across the smooth grain of a beam. He looked up and saw Ayanna standing in the doorway, wrapped in her blanket, her eyes lit with something fierce and bright. And something inside him shifted. He'd spent years cutting timber for others, never once to build something of his own, never to stay. Now, for the first time, the wood hadn't made emptiness, it had made a life. That night, in the glow of their new fire, they sat close inside the cabin's rough-hewn walls. Ayanna leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. He reached for her hand, fingers lacing in that quiet, familiar way. "This is ours now," he said softly. She looked up at him, kissed him slow, sure, like a promise. When she pulled back, her voice didn't waver. "Family," she whispered. Jack closed his eyes, let the word settle in his chest, like a fire catching in dry pine. For the first time, he believed it. After years of drifting, after months of silence, after a single storm had driven him into a cave he'd never meant to find, he wasn't alone anymore. And Ayanna was no longer a widow, lost in stone and shadow. Together they'd chosen something more than survival. They'd chosen to build. When spring stretched wide across the valley, they stepped out from the cabin side by side. The land no longer threatened, it welcomed. And when the wind came down through the pines carrying the scent of earth and bark and coming harvest, Jack Carter knew the truth in his bones. There'd be no more leaving. Not for him, not for her, not for them.